panel which comes to crown 4 days of heated debates involving a constellation of thinkers from the North and South alike, under the theme, Theaters of the Global South, Decolonial Visions. I therefore invite our first panelist to come forward to address yet some other facets of our ongoing discussion. Bilal Himoumi is a PhD candidate in Arts and Performance Studies at the University of Tetuan. And by the way, it is a well-established tradition of the Center of Performance Studies to always give a voice to researchers, emerging scholars in a field, to somehow empower them to take part in the ongoing discussions, as I said earlier. Bilal, you can come here and join me. I'd like also to seize this opportunity to thank each and everyone who contributed to making this landmark event a success. Our team of interpreters up there deserve all the gratitude we're showing them. Other members of the International Center of Performance Studies, to name but a few, Khalili, Badruddin, and many, many others, and especially our president, Dr. Professor Khalid Amin, without whom this event wouldn't have been possible at all. I now give the floor to Bilal to speak to the audience. The title of his presentation is as follows: 21st Century Moroccan Storytelling, the New Voices of Disobedience and Resistance. Bilal, podium is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I would like to thank the International Center for Performance Studies for having me today. And I would also like to thank my mentor, Professor Khalid Amin, for his leadership and also for being able to convene the greatest minds in the field of of performance studies. It was great to hear from all of them and being part of them actually in this international conference. My paper will be titled 21st Century Moroccan Storytelling, the New Voices of Disobedience and Resistance in Exclusivity. It means daily with the new trends in Moroccan storytelling, how it's developed and how the new generation is using this art in a way to form a decolonial mindset in a sense. In an interview regarding his book, The Last Storytellers, Richard Hamilton says, I quote, "I have witnessed at first hand the death throes of this rich and captivating tradition. And in the labyrinth of the Marrakesh Medina, has traced down the last few remaining storytellers, recording stories that are replete with the mysterious and the beauty of the Maghreb. I personally took issue with this statement as the oral tradition is the lifeblood of culture and in Morocco, and it continues to exist one way or another, reinventing itself according to the time and space it exists in. It does not have to rely on the stagnant methods to propagate in a way or another. It has long been stated by other Westerner expats residing in Morocco, such as Paul Bowles, Eugène Delacroix, Walter Harris, and others, that it's because of their rooted colonial ideals that they have all attempted in a way to preserve the Moroccan arts and Moroccan traditions. So they were somehow successful in reaching a consensus that they were saviors of a lost art, archivers of it to last and prosper. When it comes to the art of storytelling in Morocco, the art of narration has been omnipresent for centuries. It has been used as a method or tool to converse and preserve memories, experiences, life events, and all that comes before them. In its all complexity and merged notions, storytelling has rarely been approached as a tool of post-colonial resistance, as it was considered as a surviving art of the colonial era that has maintained its oral characteristics. However, this form of expression has always been used by masters of storytelling to transmit values, to educate children, and to subvert concepts in society, all through an intelligent, self-reflexive combination between aspects of imagination with those of reality. In this sense, storytelling became as a tool of political resistance. In the last few years, and contrary to what Richard Hamilton has foreseen, a new generation of Moroccan storytellers has emerged, especially as my paper will deal with in the city of Marrakesh, which was and is considered the beating heart of the art of narration in the country. The young apprentices are learning from master storytellers, are applying their crafts at local establishments and through cultural programs. Furthermore, these new master storytellers armed with the English or the French language have started a new trend and given the art a new life. They have started a shift in vision towards storytelling, metamorphosing it from a popular street art relying on the halqa, the square and the sphere of enigma in comprehension, to an exclusive high-end art and form of expression performed exclusively in courtyard and lounges. This shifting of space and medium has brought with it a new colonial approach to the sense of exoticism and mystery the other has always been painted with. Following an analytical approach of these stories performed and the translation conducted, as well as a comparative approach between the style of the old master and the style of the new apprentices, I aim to unearth the aspects of decoloniality in the art of Moroccan storytelling. For that, I have participated in training sessions with the Munia Associations for the Revival and Preservation of Moroccan Heritage, as well as some exclusive storytelling sessions performed for international travelers at a certain fee. I have also interviewed different young apprentices, as well as their masters, and the paper in itself attempts to architect the power dynamics in the new spaces of Moroccan storytelling, points to the methods and the tools that young storytellers use to deconstruct and subvert the relationships of power between Moroccan performer and foreign audience. And it also aims to visualize and give a voice to new voices of disobedience behind the scenes of exclusivity. The Moroccan tradition of storytelling, as I said, dates back to over 1,000 years, to a time when Marrakesh was a young city. So storytelling in itself was a way to pass on cultural beliefs, teach children moral lessons, and serve as a form of entertainment on long winter nights. So it is a compelling way for educating people of all ages and entertaining them at the same time. In this regard, storytelling was growing in parallel in two different spaces. First, in the public space, especially when men took over this art and started making it a day job. And that's how storytelling started being performed in public spheres, just as, for example, gardens, weekly markets, and local and regional festivals. And on the other hand, women continued the tradition of storytelling by using the stories they inherited as a taming tool for children, educating them on, or simply to pass on principles and ideals rooted in Morocco's traditions. Many scholars in the post-colonial era have shifted interest toward orality and oral arts in Morocco. Hence, the collection of Moroccan folktales became quite popular in the academic space, especially within the rise of cultural studies as a major field of research within an array of departments throughout the country. For example, Julali Fulkudia in Fes, for instance, coincidentally started collecting folk tales from his housemaid. And that turned into a lifelong project of collection and translation, as well as an analysis in terms of thematic load, educational aims, and artistic approach. Hasna al-Badi, on the other hand, took a different approach by collecting stories from her hometown of Tetouan and focusing on the feminist approach underpinning that are present in this centuries-old tradition. Jamal Fna Square in Marrakesh became the capital of storytelling in the country, as this tradition grew wider and more popular, starting from the late 70s. But as the years progressed, this with new technology being introduced and forms of entertainment becoming myriad and diverse, the crowd surrounding a storyteller turned smaller and smaller. Today, the Kasbah districts of Marrakesh is perhaps the unlikely bastion of this oral tradition. Since December 2013, a group of young, enthusiastic Moroccans have aggravated from around the master storyteller called Hajj Ahmed Zarghani. And since then, they have been working hard to preserve the storytelling tradition and bring the old stories and fables to a wider audience. Hajj Ahmed collected stories during his work as a traveling salesman and performed them in the turbulent 1950s outside Bab Boujloud in Fes. So now he meets with his young apprentices 3 times per week. At the first meeting, Hajj recounts a story which the apprentices then translate into English and practice. The next time they meet, they perform the story in English and Arabic for the group. And since Hajj doesn't understand much English, the young storytellers help each other and critique the translations. He also helped them by critiquing the theatricality of the performance. And on the 3rd meeting, they perform for the story at a cafe, and they, in a way, extend that to the audience and so on. This marked the beginning of a new life in the historical trajectory of Moroccan storytelling, as after this, many new projects were introduced aiming to preserve and develop the art of storytelling in Morocco, including the Mounia Association for the Preservation of Moroccan Heritage. These young master storytellers, armed with English and expertise in social media, started promoting these programs, which helped create a buzz around them. They hence became on-demand storytellers by high-end and luxury hotels and travel operators who sought them to present this art to their travelers. Therefore, the story that was performed free of charge for a mere few dirhams, if desired, in the bustling Jamal Fna Square, turned into one of the most exclusive experiences, costing hundreds of dollars to enjoy in the privacy of a lounge or a room. This new kind of storytelling in exclusivity creates a new sphere of power dynamics that dismantled the exotic nature of the other that was created before in the square. It's made the storyteller a powerful being who sets the tone for the experience, decides the timing, the pricing, and his or her art are automatically elevated. In my interviews with 4 apprentices, storytellers, who are all students of the English department in English, Jawad Al-Biad, for example, who is 24, is just finishing his English degree with a dissertation in Moroccan storytelling. He says that this art has a special value in his Moroccan society, but young kids today don't know the stories. They are only interested in the internet or something like that, and they are a little bit distracted. So for him, this art reminds him of the generation of his grandfather and reminds him of his origins. So he turned into this, and with a collection of his friends, he wanted to clear that that storytelling becomes a tool for him to speak out and voice his own concerns and his own future for the country and so on. It is clear that storytelling has benefited him and his fellow apprentices. He speaks confidently and eloquently in English, and twice a week he does so before a large crowd at the cultural cafe. Furthermore, through the Hikayat program, which is in the process of becoming a non-profit association in Morocco. He has the opportunity to travel around Morocco and even to Iran to share the stories and teach them to others. The storytellers have also appeared in many international programs or TV shows in the UK or Al Jazeera and something like that. One of them has also traveled to Dubai for the Expo 2020. And in a way, it gave this Moroccan art that was, in a way, structured in the square of Jamal Fna or in the privacy of the houses or the courtyard of the riads to an international audience, subverting in a way the power relations that actually connected them. However, no researcher or practitioner truly works alone. In this way, narrative-based projects are not only helpful for connecting generations in the present, but also they connect the practitioner to those who have used and developed these methods before them. As the practitioner, then, one inherits a wealth of knowledge. This knowledge is important for informing the careful planning that should be foregrounded as part of any initiatives which involved human subjects. But it also brings with it an obligation to humbly consider the missteps, the insight, the impacts of those who have carried out this work before us. Before any particular method can be employed responsibly, then it is helpful to understand the larger context in which the approach evolved. Scholarly interest in the stories that people share proliferated through the mid-20th century, producing a significant shift in how narratives were studied, theorized, and understood within academic, educational, and clinical circles. In many ways, the development owed to their roots to what is often referred to as the linguistic turn, to the work of scholars like John Pocock or Patrick Joyce, Quentin Skinner. Historians began to question the assumption that historical interpretation was objective. Emphasizing the links between philosophy and language, these scholars argued that the work of historians could not be separated from their own ideological and cultural influences. Rather than describing the past as it really happened, then increasingly, historians came to see that the past could not be separated from their textual representation. Work by postmodern theorist Michel Foucault infused studies of narrative with power analysis. Rather than focusing on how individuals or discrete structures wield power as instruments of coercion through specific acts or episodes, Foucault argued that the power was dispersed and pervasive. Using a nexus of power knowledge, he argued that accepted forms of scientific understanding, truth, and culture and all exemplified a kind of microphysics that is primarily discursive, embodied not individuals, but within societies. These understandings continue to influence scholarship today, including a burgeoning interest in narrative studies among political scientists and social movement theorists. Viewed through a theoretical lens, most traditional narratives actually take pains to separate story from narrative. Story is understood in the building blocks, such as events, places. Narrative is, on the other hand, how the teller assembles those pieces together, putting the block together, and giving them meaning and crafting a larger structure. Together, this distinction creates a framework that can be applied to interpret various texts written or spoken. These theoretical contributions proliferated through the mid to late 20th century era of global freedom struggles, from the anti-colonial sovereignty and civil rights struggles that spanned every region of the world. Many scholars and practitioners sought to change how academics understood and documented and interpreted human experience. So for historians, this included a move away from relying primarily on written text to understanding all human communication as a text. It resulted in an increasing push to recover hidden or missing voices within existing historical records. I consider these new storytellers as the hidden missing voices of storytelling. So when we speak of decoloniality in itself, we refer to the new ways to think beyond the epistemic and territorial borders established by the colonization of the 15th or 16th century. It is necessary to identify the forms of actors and institutions devalued by these borders. It is then possible to better detach oneself from this conceptual device by opting for an epistemic turnaround, which consists in favoring, in the footsteps of Fanon in particular, the sociogenesis of a being who exists where he thinks, in an environment multiversal. Such a gap is the result of an act of emancipation that dares to transgress the reference of the abstract universalism inherited from the moderns to dominate the world. It is an act of epistemic disobedience. Winston Churchill once said, "First we shape our buildings, then our buildings shape our future." In case of future studies, it can be said that first we shape our future and then our future shapes us. Since the future doesn't exist yet, the future that we are referring to is merely an image of the future, and it is this image that shapes our attitude and actions. When storytelling in this racialized groups was described as a contributing to decolonization, stories were centered on individual lived experiences that were inextricably connected to their communities. To each participant's story, their voice carries their needs, desires, strengths, resiliencies in the context of their greater community, and are not filtered through the audience perspective or biases. In this sense, the storyteller or the new storyteller in this exclusive or closed space gets a little bit of a more power to create a story that is connected to his own aspirations for the future, his own influences from the past, and also to exert more power on how the connection between audience and performer or practitioner is. Particularly evident in knowledge production as a person in fact that storytelling is agentic and participatory. Growing up in a world assaulted by colonial powers, denying them an array of opportunities, these storytellers have never been silent in the face of colonial violence or that subverted and neutralized various other forms of resistance. The storytellers and griots have never been idle, working through participatory mediums to maintain and sustain ways of being and living. Because as a new generation who has been armed with the tools of social media, and also as a generation that has endured the effects of the colonial era, actually, they have been more vocal about like the issues that they face on a day-to-day basis. And these storytellers were successful in implicitly including that sense of, in a way, their own disappointments in terms of the relationships of power in the world. Here, the role of the storyteller is central to the exercise of agency and renewal. In the colonial traditions around the world, storytellers are sacred knowledge keepers, and they shape communities through the spoken and written words. Stories are not only agentic and individual, but they are communal, sharings that bind communities together spiritually and relationally. Their stories are more than a lesson, a teaching, or even a historical account. Their conscious and knowing agreement directly extends to our philosophies, to our thoughts, and also actions as Moroccan people. Hence, the epistemological disobedience as they carry local philosophies, epistemologies, and theories within their narratives. To conclude, the new trends of Moroccan folktales and ways of storytelling are varied as the locations and peoples they emanate from, as varied as the forms of oppression they speak against, and as varied as the methods of resistance they contain and speak to. We should not take up an idealistic or naive view of personal narratives and stories because of the relationality and locatedness that they emanate from, as they are fraught with tensions and contestations. But these contestations, rather than disabling resistance and political actions because of a tepid relativistic framework, strengthen and build a mobile, diverse, and amphibious movements built on the diverse agents at work against colonial power. Moroccan stories are a reclamation of our voice, our land, and our sovereignty. They are vital to decolonization. Therefore, storytelling works to both deconstruct colonial ways to come into know, as well as to construct alternatives, recognizing that these two processes do not happen in a linear trajectory. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Bilal, for this enlightening presentation, which falls within the scope of what we've been doing during the last 4 days. Just by way of recapitulating, in his paper, Bilal has brought to light what he refers to as the younger generation of storytellers in the Moroccan society. Bilal thinks of storytelling as a mode of resistance, a form of subversion, and perhaps of border thinking that is now reclaiming its rightful place, its legitimate seat. In this respect, Bilal retrieves voices of disobedience, as he calls them, voices of dissidents in the global south, voices that strike back to power in the semantics, semiotics, linguistics in general of Halqa, as enacted in Jamalfna. So thank you very much, Bilal. I spoke earlier on of Bilal as being an emerging scholar. I think he's on the right path to becoming a scholar, okay, because of the work he's been doing. It's well researched, well documented, lots of interviews, lots of field work, and that's what we expect from the next generation. Now we're going to move to our next speakers. Abderrahim Al-Wahabi, who is now working as a high school teacher in Tangier. He has recently obtained his PhD. The topic and focus of his dissertation is Moroccan theater from text translation to stage transplantation, and his research interests more broadly include translation and performance studies. He's also an active member of the International Center for Performance Studies. He will be speaking together with Professor Mohammed Al-Mushdaqi, my friend and colleague at King Fahd School of Translation, who holds a PhD degree in theater translation from the same said university, Al-Mercedi. He too is an active member of the International Center of Performance Studies. So I invite you to come and speak to our audience. And the title of your presentation is as follows: Alienation in Moroccan Theater, Mustafa Ramdani's play, Ghorba as a case study. You changed the title. Transplantation as a form of rewriting, the formation of a new identity, Sidna Qadar as a case study. So last minute change. See Rahim. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chairman, Dr. Jamal Qabli. First of all, I would like to thank the International Center for Performance Studies for giving us this opportunity to express our thoughts and ideas. The title of our presentation is Transplantation as a Form of Rewriting, the Formation of a New Identity, and we'll be focusing on Mohammed Qawti's Sidna Qadar. Moroccan theater productions have been prone to various cultural and historical influences. Because of that, many Moroccan playwrights deem it essential to develop new forms of Moroccan theater productions. For instance, Mohammed Qawti has delved deeply into transplanting theater works from one culture to another. A deep analysis of his works highlights a revolution in the Moroccan theater productions. Transplantation, al-istinbat in Arabic, is a concept that has been developed by Mohammed Qawti through a particular adaptive approach. Qawti rejects the practice of the naive adaptation as practiced generally in the Arab world and particularly in Morocco. He asserts that his adaptive approach is neither the transformation of a work from one genre to another genre, nor its actualization, which consists in adapting contemporary circumstances, the taste of the new public and the story that the evolution of society makes necessary. In fact, the concept of transplantation for Mohammed Qawti is the production of a new text from a previously written text in a new social context. Adaptation as practiced by Qawti would rather proceed from a dramaturgical approach situated between semiology and sociology, opting for an analysis which goes beyond the semiological description of the scenic systems, since it asks in a pragmatic way what the spectator will receive from representation, to which the theater leads into the ideological and aesthetic reality of the public. Relating to his transplanted work, Qawti qualifies the work he accomplishes as compound betrayal. Betrayal because in general, no adapter as good and well-versed in translation as it is can restore to the genius proper to the source language of the text it transposes in its own language. It can't restore the sounds, the organization of breathing, the stereotypes, the nuances, the poetic immanence, and the syntactical economy of the original work. The adapter can only transfer the work into his own linguistic receptacle by operating a perfect X-ray, faithfully retracing the framework and emphasizing as clearly as possible the carnal contours without giving the essential to this body, which on the molecular level makes it a distinct and unique body. Thus, the use of the adjective compound finds in Qawti's approach all his motivation, because it is necessary to think and compose a distinct work that is both similar to the adapted work, restoring the spirit, and different, since it is intended for a Moroccan public. Faced with this impossibility of transposing a foreign work objectively and faithfully, Qawti finds it legitimate to proceed in a different way by opting for transfiguration of the original work. This approach, he says, is likely to make possible a distanced adaptation by differentiation with the historical adaptation commonly adopted, and to open access to the temptation of the semantic transmutation of a work. According to Qawti, this transplantation goes through several stages, the first of which is what he calls the position of the work. It is an initial approach during which the playwright sees a text he likes, trying to account for the chromatic grain of the semantics of this text, while avoiding the traps of totalitarian interpretation that encompasses or claims to encompass all the elements of a given set, and which assumes, in this case, immoderation, that is to say, extreme loyalty, a pompous claim to objectivity and perfect unilaterality. During this first stage, the playwright, thus, in addition to reading and rereading, a research work to collect as much information as possible about the work he wants to transplant. The playwright would spend a lot of time to document the work, its author, the circumstances of its appearance, the historical period which it was born. The practice of adaptation requires a greater margin of interweaving of the spectacular cultures. It is in this spirit that the name of Mohammed Qawti is distinguished in the Moroccan theatrical landscape as a pioneer and creative adapter. He reads the text in its original version, pierces it, patiently decorates its symbols, examines its internal rhythms, studies its philosophical, political, aesthetic references, inquires about the circumstances in which it was played on stage, and studies what was written about it. And it is after all this that the journey begins to find the best way to transplant the spirit of the text into a different spectacular culture. This step gives rise to a first draft, first translation, adaptation, fairly faithful to the original text. Then comes the stage of the re-actualization, which is carried out via the performance. It is the phase of the recomposition and the rewriting, during which the playwright accomplishes the most complex part of his work by transfiguring the text and injecting it with doses of imagination, social codes, ways of saying, dialect, and Moroccan gestures. The Qawtian work is a pamphlet's work, to use an expression according to Gérard Genet. Each time you scratch the text of a work, you discover other texts and stories. The hypotext can be literally text, as well as popular legends or episodes of great history. They can be drawn from the Arab Muslim heritage, as well as from universal culture. The practice of intertextuality in all its complexity is a constant in Qawti's work. As was customary in the Moroccan amateur theater of the 1970s, he drew of his fables from the Arab Muslim heritage, especially from the mystical background. It was until 1985 that the Moroccan theater saw the birth of what is considered today as one of the classics and masterpieces of the local repertoire, Sidna Qdar, which is a transplantation after Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. The piece was produced by two groups, first by As-Salam Barnoussi, staged by Ibrahim Nashikh, 1988, then by Masrah al-Shams, staged by Abdel-Ilah Ajil in 2000. It was the first time that this play was adapted by a Moroccan playwright. Saddiqi had already done so in the 1960s by naming it Fi Intidar Mabrouk. From the start and from the title, we notice that we are not in the same register of dramatic transposition, because if the title of the piece of Saddiqi refers explicitly and syntactically resembles the title of the original piece, only Godot is replaced by the Arabic name Mabrouk. The title that Qawti gives to his piece comes from another approach, much more advanced, because it didn't seek to operate a parallelism which refers directly to the source text, but drew on the depth of Moroccan culture to find the title which best expresses this idea of expectation which carries the Beckettian text. Sidna Qdar refers to Laylat al-Qadr, the sacred night which takes place once a year. It is a night during which, according to popular belief, the doors of heaven open for a brief instant, during which, if people manage to make a wish, plea, God will grant it. In Morocco, in popular areas, the term Layla, night, has been replaced by Sidna, which can be translated as our Lord, thus personifying this event. For the term Sidna is generally used to refer to God or state honorifics
accompanying the proper name of an exceptional person. Thus, the title reveals this desire of Qawti to anchor the piece in a purely local soil by appealing to the linguistic imagination of Moroccans. The playwright was therefore very sensitive to the themes of the lack of perspective and of the absurdity of the expectation which one perceives in the Beckettian text, in the measure that these two isotopes made him think of his own situation. Qawti says that he finds something primeval in Beckett's work, the references of Judeo-Christian culture, which despite all this work, find their counterparts in his Arab-Muslim culture. It is the case of one of the important themes that is apostasy. For in the attitude of the Beckettian characters, at times, there is a certain revolt against God or any metaphysical instance which in indifference leaves humanity to its misfortune. Wanting to commit suicide is in itself an act of rebellion to end this existence. It is a highly reprehensible act according to the three monotheistic religions. But the Qawtian characters go even farther than those of Beckett, because if at the end of the original piece, Valdemar and Estragon didn't go to the end of the suicide attempt, Zaid and Kurayt did. They didn't die, they killed themselves. There is something we don't understand that Beckett missed. In preparing the edition of Sid Naqdar, Qawti added a last act which he entitled One Day. It is a sort of epilogue in which we see the messenger returning. We don't know if it is the same messenger as that of the first and second acts. The question is left in suspense by the dramaturge. The first of the 7 epitaphs begins with the night they hanged themselves. They were ennobled, clearly indicating the tragic end of the 2 comrades. These acts, which seems to be the result and the outcome of the existence of these 2 beings, is reformulated in the 2nd epitaph, the night during which they hanged themselves. This sentence opens all the following epitaphs. This end imagined by Qawti takes place in the same tree that saw their history begin. This account, intended for the readers and spectators, and perhaps for the whole of humanity, first tells in a poetic way the story of Zaid and Kurayt, their wait without hope, and then last moments of solitude they lived before their death. It is also about their passivity, the nonsense of their existence. Except for the addition of the 3rd act, the general structure of the original piece is respected. The Moroccan piece being divided into 2 acts, that night and this night. However, Qawti made another very important change by choosing as temporality night instead of Beckettian day. Moreover, he is convinced that Estragon, Valdemar, Pozo, and Lucky are rather nocturnal characters, and according to him, it is quite natural that their meeting takes place during the night. This is a wise choice because the night makes the atmosphere even heavier, even more threatening. On several occasions, the Qawti characters complain about the length of the night. The arrival of the day becomes another expectation, which is added to that Sidna Aqdar. This transformation obviously involved a change in the replica where it is a question of time. The other important modifications occur either when the playwright believes that the faithful recovery of a passage of Waiting for Godot does not serve its writing strategy in terms of consistency, or when it considers that the situation or the story narrated in the original piece would not, outside its European context, be understood by the Moroccan spectator. It goes without saying that Qawti has given his piece a local color, and it has been implanted in a Moroccan rural environment, the Shawya. If the decor has remained minimalist, as it appears in Beckett's play, and therefore does not give precise indications of the place where the fable takes place, the costumes, for their part, give a very precise idea of the characters. They are harvesters. However, if we look at where the bulk of Qawti's transplantation work resides, we have to look at the language used. This dialectal language proper to the region of Shawya, this rural dialect that the dramaturge perfectly masters, if we dare to say, is the main character of the transplantations of Qawti. Waiting for Godot discloses a structure of expectations that is linked to an entire absence, which may ease the play's output. The apparent pattern of theatrical conflicts is the central position of the text. In his transplantation of the play, he focused on reformulating the semantic structure of the two pairs through a woven theatricality of an act in an action, an absence in attendance. This variance allowed for freeing the connotations and urged Moroccan recipients to apply a symbolic eye. Hence, Sidna Qadar presents the semantic presentation in terms of structure of expectations in which the signs are separated from an absent signified. Now I give the floor to Dr. Al-Mashqi to give more in-depth details about these idiosyncratic characteristics of Sidna Qadar. Thank you.
Well, it's nice to be with you here, of course. I would like first to thank my professor, Dr. Khaled Amin, for organizing this very distinguished annual conference in its 17th, yes, you know, the 17th time he organizes this. And thank you so much, my dear friend, colleague Abdulrahman Douabi. I'm going to resume what you have just said. So, it is well known that the play Waiting for Godot was written more than once by its original author, of course, Samuel Beckett, because the man wrote it in two languages, or rather, two formulas, French and English. In fact, Beckett's writing challenges many other modern practices, including criticism of the laws of absolute language and the specific and ruthlessly, and I'm sorry, and the specific, yes, and ruthlessly until this critique is directed to the same identity, criticism of representation, history, and ideology. In addition to moving to French, breaking up syntax in combination, violating punctuation, and deviating from the specific laws and customs of embezzlement of novel, article, poem, and painting, Beckett's late entry into the theater can be read as another means of a long war against the word and as a kind of journey to action instead of text and picture. Qawti relied on the French version and was able to dig in the text, which is loaded, with philosophical meanings inspired from Nietzsche and Heidegger. He was successful in his dialogue with the original text before transplanting it. It's also obvious from the title he chooses as a means to enter the world of waiting. Sidna Qadar, in the modern popular memory, is an intensive coding of the act of waiting and waiting. It is believed by the majority of ordinary people that at an indefinite time of the 27th night of the holy month of Ramadan, Sidna Qadar is in a position to realize the aspirations of all those who managed to prepare the night before for this exceptional meeting. In the Moroccan popular image, he was able to equate the character to Santa Claus, as known to Christians. It is true that the choice of Qawti of Sid Naqdar as a title and a way to transplant the spirit of a philosophical text loaded with existential issues was not purely by chance, as Sid Naqdar, of course, was tied, given the Moroccan popular belief, to a sacred night for Moroccans, and it was Laylat al-Qadr, the night of the decree, of course. Thus, the work of Qawti in Sid Naqdar is essentially a transition from a Christian belief or cultural structure in waiting for Godot to another Islamic cultural belief structure. It is a dialogue with Islamic holy religion. For Qawti, Sid Naqdar symbolizes a fate that is absent or consecutive, but it is the center of significance in the whole play despite its absence. This particular absence does not raise the desire to produce meaning to the spectator. The result is not a plurality in conflicting definitions of Sid Naqdar, and each is a special reading of what Sid Naqdar is. Beckett's plays continue to represent situations created by the actor, spectator, character, and reader. Focus of attention is the direct place where the character is thrown and the technical situation displayed becomes a place of life shared by the actor and the spectator. The displaced people of Beckett's Vladimir and Estragon, or in turn, Koryat and Zoriat, do nothing except wait for Godot or Sid Naqdar to appear. While waiting for them, they talk, eat, curse each other, try to commit suicide, exchange hats, and imitate characters of Pozo and Lucky, or Ibtar and Zmar. The core of Godot, Sid Naqdar, show is the incessant mutual waiting, and hence Godot or Sid Naqdar becomes a degree of the subject of all forms of waiting. For the spectator, there are other subjects such as waiting for action or theatrical act and waiting for the end of waiting. The common ground, the characters and spectators, or the common ground between the characters and spectators is the act of waiting alike. Nothing is the first word Zayat said, and in fact embodies Beckett's reception that nothing is more real than nothingness. Even the simplest movements, such as the removal of the shoe from his legs, has become difficult and strenuous. In view of the structure of the play as a whole, the two tracks are still stuck by the influence of time. The path of they are confronted, the Ibar and Zmar, ended because of the physical disability and consequences of paradoxes. The path of Koryat and Zuriat alerts to a rotation in vicious cycles in which the expectation of Sid Naqdar is the center of the contract and the point of the intersection of all beginnings and ends. Gradually, the tragedy of Ibtar and Zmar became a symbol of the human tragedy as represented by the epic of waiting for Godot, or for both Koryat and Zayat. The most prominent thing that confirms what was mentioned about the transplantation is the intelligent adventure of Muhammad Qawti in adding a third chapter of the play, One Day, without dissenting its essence and its tightly constructed structure. In addition to the first chapter, the night and the second chapter and second chapter this night, a third chapter was added to be held on the day of the morning in the same place. A village road that stands in the middle of the road, a dead tree, part of which was loaned by the ground and the decay came on its part. The side of the road borders a rock. The facts of this chapter are like a post-conclusion where the body enters from the backstage of the garden. We don't know whether it's the same boy from that night or the same boy from this night or the same boy from that night and this night, but we're sure he is a one-day boy. He wears the same clothes of that night and this night, to quote Qawti, of course. The boy heads toward the stage and addresses the public, confirming that no one sent him this time, but he nevertheless carries a message to those who are interested in it. His message is the contents of 7 tomes of both Qur'at and Zuriyat and of those who went their way from mankind. Qawti's choice of see the tomes witness has more than indicative, and the number of graves confined to 7 refers to the symbolism of this figure in the Islamic cultural structure, especially the Moroccan one. The tomb's witness is one of the most important cultural records and archaeological sources to tell about many facts of people who have lived, suffered, and who have died at some time. The tomb's witness scenes are extensive written sources in history and heritage, not to mention being archaeological evidence of high value. With Qawti, the tomb's witness turns into a record recording the tragedies of Qur'at and Zuriyat in the time of waiting. The same phrase of Qur'at and Zuriyat is repeated in the head of the tomb's witness. They lived with nothing and died with nothing, followed by 7 seemingly different texts, but united in their eloquent embodying of the tragic situation of Qur'at and Zuriyat. To conclude, Sid Naqdar is conceived as a new authentic text with its own typical characteristics. It has gone beyond the typical adaptation to dialoguing with the original text and transplanted it in a Moroccan Islamic cultural and belief structure. The transplanted texts are no more a copy of the original texts, but rather new texts that are different in terms of language, form, structure, and content. Thank you so much.